Now, when I was in high school, I was able to make a little money mowing grass. I enjoyed mowing grass for the most part. Some of my clients, I think, were happy that I mowed their grass because I think they were able to charge me a little bit less than they would have charged somebody else. And one of those properties was our church property. And so every week, every 2 weeks, I would mow our church property. And then after I left, Byron took up that job, actually. And part of the yard, it was about a 3-4 hour job total. And part of the church property ran right up against some property that we did not own, but it was nothing but weeds and thorn bushes and just kind of completely untended property. And the owner of that property never really did much to keep it cleared either. And even though that other property looked really ugly, I didn't really mind that property looking that way, because whenever I was done mowing grass, the grass that I mowed looked so much better because of how ugly the other property looked. And because of that, I was fine with how the other property looked. Now, as we look at this passage today, we see that God will use ugly and even agonizing situations to show more clearly who He is, how good He is, and what His true plan is as well. At this point in the book of John, we see that Jesus had healed a man born blind in chapter 9. And then in chapter 10, many of you know that that is the chapter where He speaks of Himself as the Good Shepherd. And now both of these events included an angry group of Jews who wanted to arrest Jesus and even kill Jesus. And throughout the book of John, we see that John is building a case that Jesus is the Son of God, and since He is the Son of God, we must believe in Him. How does John build this case? He builds it a few different ways. He builds it through Jesus' teaching, but he also builds it through various sign miracles that Jesus does throughout the book. When we think of the miracles so far that we have looked at here in our series through the book of John, we've seen Jesus turn water into wine at the wedding of Cana. We've seen Him heal an official's son. We saw Him heal a lame man at the Pool of Bethesda. We saw Him feed the 5,000, walk on water, and then more recently healing a man born blind. And now today, right after Jesus has finished the Good Shepherd story, He is going to introduce us to the next sign miracle that we're going to look at today, showing that Jesus is the Son of God, that miracle being the resurrection of someone who has clearly died and who has been dead for days even. So the first thing we'll see here in this passage is in verses 1 through 4, we'll see that Jesus allows suffering so that He can show His glory. Jesus allows suffering so that He can show His glory. If you would like to look with me at verses 1 through 4. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped His feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to Him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, He said, This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Jesus allows suffering so that He can show His glory. Now, how does this story start off? If you look with me again at verse 1, it says here that now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Excuse me. As we look at this passage here today, and as you think of how stories normally work, think of any story that you've heard, whether it's in the Bible or not. Normally you have what's called a setting to the story, kind of gives you the basic introductory details. And then eventually you go into what's called the conflict of the story, where something goes wrong. Same thing if you watch a TV show, you watch a movie, something like that. There is going to be kind of a setting that sets the stage. Then you're going to have the problems. And then the rest of the story is about solving the problems, right? And so it seems that John here is almost in a hurry to get from the setting right into the conflict of the story. And that's what he does in verse 1. In fact, he begins with a conflict. A certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, and then he kind of gives a little bit of the setting right there. We see here that John then introduces the characters of the story. Who is in this story? Of course, God is always going to be a main character in the story, and we have his son, Jesus Christ, main character in the story. But introduced here at the beginning is Lazarus of Bethany. Bethany is a village very close to Jerusalem. If you've ever seen pictures of the Mount of Olives and how close that is to the old city of Jerusalem, it's basically on the other side of the Mount of Olives. Scholars believe maybe about 2 miles away or something like that from the city of Jerusalem. So not far. This was where Jesus would typically stay when he was in Jerusalem as well. And it goes on here in verse 2 to say, it was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So, interestingly, up to this point in the book of John, John does not mention Lazarus or Mary or Martha, but he speaks of them as if everyone knows them. And we know that John is the final gospel to be written, probably written close to AD 100, AD 90, something like that. And so all believers would have heard the stories of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? And other people who had lived through that, eyewitnesses who had lived through and had heard accounts of everything that happened. So Lazarus and Mary and Martha were well known to basically anyone who had been a Christian for a while, or who had lived in that area and heard of the life of Jesus and the different things that he had done. Now we will see this event here where it says that Mary had anointed him with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair. That actually comes up in the next chapter. So it's as if he's giving us a hint of something that might happen, that will happen here in the next chapter, but he's saying this is something that had already happened, but we're going to talk about it later. We see here then, after introducing the characters, that the sisters send word to Jesus about Lazarus' illness. So if you look with me at verse 3, so the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. Period. And that's really all that John records that they had said. Now, if it were me, is that all I would say? I would probably also say, please come quickly, right? But evidently in that culture, and especially speaking to someone of authority like Jesus was, they decided, Mary and Martha just decided to make it a very indirect plea for help. Said, Jesus, he whom you love, all right, really turning the screws there. Jesus, this is someone you love, is ill. And the idea, again, is that he is very ill. If he was, just kind of down with a cold, let's not bother the master, right? But since he is ill, seems to a very high degree, we need to get Jesus involved, see if he will come, come and help us. Now, at this point, Jesus, he had left Jerusalem. In chapter 10, verse 40 and 41, it tells us that he went across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing at first. So pretty far away from Judea, pretty far away from the danger, maybe about 100 miles away. But Mary and Martha knew where Jesus was, so they were able to send word to tell him about what had happened. So they use this indirect plea for help, and then Jesus comments on the news that he received. If you look with me at verse 4, Jesus says, but when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now, again, we all know how this story continues. We know that Lazarus actually dies. So why does Jesus say that this does not lead unto death? Doesn't that seem like even an untruth, you might say? I believe what Jesus means here is that this disease, this illness that he has, does not lead to permanent death. This is not the type of death where he is gone and gone forever. All right? So in Jesus' mind and in the way he is approaching a subject, even though Lazarus is going to legitimately die, Lazarus will come back to life. And so that's why Jesus speaks of it in this way. Excuse me. We see here that this, as he says, this illness would not be permanent. It would further the Father's mission for Jesus. Again, look at how Jesus describes this in the last part of verse 4. It is for the glory of God, all right, that in itself, is enough, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. This is for the glory of the Father. This is for the glory of the Son. So we see that this whole event of someone that he loves getting very, very ill and going through this suffering, and his loved ones suffering right along with him out of concern and grief, all this is for the glory of God, and so the Son of God may be glorified through it as well. It's very important for us to grasp this, because in our day and age, it seems cruel that someone might take advantage of someone who is suffering. But we have to recognize that God's plans are greater than ours. God owns all of us. God created all of us. We all exist for the glory of God. And so we should never have a problem with the fact of God seeking glory for himself through the challenges, the suffering, the agony that we all might face, because we exist for God's glory. So Jesus allows suffering so that he can show his glory. How many times have we heard someone say, "You're going to be all right"? All right, we hear that, loved ones, friends, we hear that, in some sort of program we might be watching. Friends might say it, parents will say it, a doctor might say it, and depending on who says it, you may feel confident that you'll be all right, or you may not feel that confident. If a friend who knows absolutely nothing about how you're feeling and you just kind of poured your heart out to that person and the reply is, "Oh, you're going to be all right," it might not really make you feel that much better. In fact, you might even feel worse because you're frustrated that your friend doesn't seem to care too much about how you are feeling. But how should we feel if Jesus says we're going to be all right? We should feel great, right? We should feel amazing. We should feel relieved. We should feel blessed and thankful. We shouldn't continue the worry and the agony of heart and mind that we might be going through. And we might even think, okay, I'm going to be all right. This suffering, whatever it is going to leave me any second now. So while we should believe believe Jesus when he says that everything will be all right, as he says in this passage, we still have to realize that sometimes things can be more complicated than that. Just because everything is going to be all right doesn't mean that the suffering is over. Maybe we won't be all right by our own standards. Maybe we will get sicker. Maybe the trial will get worse. Maybe we will die from what we are struggling with. And these thoughts are not very encouraging. But when we look at this passage, these thoughts should not be our focus. Now, we're never going to completely escape from thoughts like these, right? But we should be thinking exactly what Jesus told Lazarus and what Jesus meant by what he told Lazarus and his sisters. This illness does not lead to death. This trial that you are facing is not the ultimate thing that you are going to face. This is not the end of the world for you. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now we can believe this, because even though our body may die, we, of course, will not truly die. We all believe in the resurrection, right? That is the hope of the believer, the resurrection, that we will be with him for eternity. We believe that even though our body may die, our soul, our being, will not truly die if we have believed in Jesus for our salvation and given our lives completely to him. In order to believe these words to the fullest, though, we must take Jesus' values, we must make his values our values. We must make his reality our reality. We must turn our eyes away from earthly things and trust that the future that God has for us will be so much better. We must make his desires our desires. We must make his mind our mind. It really means a renewal of our mind, as Paul calls all of us to do day after day. We must want his glory above our own. So we see here in the first 4 verses that Jesus allows suffering so that he can show his glory. But this part of the story goes on. We see next in verses 5 through 10 that Jesus allows suffering so that he can show his love. Again, if we are tempted to think, man, Jesus, all he cares about is his own glory, that's not, very selfless of him. Again, that in itself is a problem if that is our thinking. But if you ever had a doubt, look with me at verses 5 through 10. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of the world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him." Jesus allows suffering so that he can show his love. If you look again at verse 5, we see that Jesus receiving glory through Lazarus' illness is not the whole story. Jesus loved him. Jesus loved his sisters. He loved this family. And since he loved them, he wanted what was truly best for them. Again, as it says here, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. And then we see here this love caused Jesus to delay his coming by 2 days. Now, for someone who is deathly ill, that is a very strange decision if you have the power to actually help this person. So in verse 6, again, he says, "So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was." Now this, as I mentioned earlier, as a story involves a setting the stage, an introduction. It involves conflict. And here in this part of the story, we see the conflict and the tension rise up to a new level. We're all sitting here frustrated, right? Well, if you're going to help him, why don't you do it right away? If you're a first-time reader or listener of this story, that's probably what you're thinking if you're paying attention. Why don't you just go there right away, Jesus? You have the ability to do that. You can even teleport there and teleport back. Hey, you can even heal him from a distance. You've done that before. But that's not what happens. Jesus delays his coming by 2 days. And this, again, introduces more drama, tension into the story. Because if you love someone, wouldn't you come right away? Is there anyone in this room that if you got that news and you knew there was something that you can do, even to provide some comfort, even to encourage them if it's their last few minutes alive on this earth, wouldn't you go right away if you had that ability? Absolutely. But he didn't. Now moving to verse 7. Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." Now, the disciples definitely had an opinion about this. I'm sure they cared about Lazarus, but they didn't understand, of course, the whole story yet. So the disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again?" So here we see that Jesus tells his disciples that they're going back to Judea, the place of grave danger for Jesus. And the disciples' words show that it was extremely risky, again, for Jesus even to go to Bethany. Bethany being very close to Jerusalem. Again, people in this day and age, they would, even though just a couple miles, there would be people traveling this route all the time. They would be traveling from Jerusalem to Bethany, cross the Jordan, go up the east side of the Jordan, go to Galilee. That was the pathway so they could avoid Samaria and so forth. So there would be people constantly traveling this route, and word would travel fast, right? Because everyone, that you had the marketplaces, it wasn't people could, sit at home like we do and buy everything you need on Amazon and have it delivered right to your door. People would talk to people every day. You'd see the same people basically every day. You'd have to, if you were the one responsible for getting water at the well, you'd see everyone at the well, right? And that's just how life operated. And so people would always share the latest news. It was only natural. And so people would find out very quickly if Jesus was back in the area, and then that word would eventually spread to people that would want to hurt Jesus. It could mean Jesus' death. But we see here in the next couple verses that Jesus replies that people's spiritual needs are more important than his safety. And he says that there's only so much time to accomplish his mission and that he will need to take that risk. If you look with me at verses 9 and 10, these are, I think, on the surface, kind of confusing verses. It said in verse 9, Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of the world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him." So what is Jesus doing here? He's using a very common example of how a typical day goes. You have an average, you might say, of 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness. And Jesus is using that well-known fact to then illustrate how he is the light and that his time on earth is limited. Just like there are 12 hours of day and then the darkness comes, he's only got what he would call his 12-hour window to make an impact before he is gone and the night comes. So he's saying, since it is light now, let's do what needs to be done, because the darkness is coming when there will not be an opportunity like what we have right now. And I believe that's what Jesus is saying here through these verses. So Jesus allows suffering so that he can show his love. Now, the men in the room here this morning who are married or who have a special someone know what it means to create an opportunity. So let's say you want to ask a girl to be your girlfriend, or you want to ask your girlfriend to be your wife. There's a good chance that you've thought a lot about how you're going to pull that off. We've heard some stories here of how that has happened. Just thinking of Pastor Ben's engagement story there as well. And can't remember all the details, but I remember that was a little bit rougher than what you had originally planned. And that's what happens. We work hard to create an opportunity, but some things don't quite go the way we hope they would. But you still have put a lot of effort and time into trying to plan and make that opportunity happen. You decide that you're going to pop the question in a favorite spot, like maybe a nice restaurant or a beautiful place outdoors with an amazing view. You try to think of all the details so that nothing gets in your way of showing how much you care about your special someone, and nothing in the way of communicating that very important message that you want to communicate. You work hard to create an opportunity to express your true feelings for that person. Now, while this story in John chapter 11 is obviously a little different than that type of opportunity, we see that Jesus is essentially doing the same thing. He is creating an opportunity, yes, to show his glory, but also to show how much he loves his friends and his followers. Now, we might think that, wow, this is kind of an unkind way. This is kind of a backhanded way to show someone that you love them. You just let them die. Let their loved one die. Isn't love supposed to get rid of suffering as quickly as possible? But we see here that Jesus allows them to suffer even longer. We all know, though, that the tougher the situation, the greater impact Jesus' deliverance will have on our life. Right? I mean, what situations in your lives come to mind that Jesus delivered you from? It probably wasn't something that happened just like that, and it was sort of minor, like maybe you had a quiz that you were really concerned about, and you prayed and asked God for help, and then you got an A on it. Probably a lot of those have happened for those of us that have been in school, right? But how many of those do you remember? Not very many. It's those more drawn out and more heart-wrenching experiences that we remember how God came through for us. And we would not remember it. It would not really have made as big of an impact unless it had gotten really, really difficult, really, really bad. So for example, let's say someone was homeless and then cried out to God for help. Jesus' love of providing a home is going to make an incredible impact because of how difficult the situation that they are in was. So when we see our suffering get worse and worse, instead of turning to doubt and despair, what should we be thinking? We should be turning to greater faith, knowing that God is doing something in our lives out of his great love for us. And if he allows that suffering to stretch on and on and on, be encouraged that God is at work. For a very special reason, is allowing that suffering, whatever it is, to continue. Jesus allows suffering so that he can show his love. And then lastly, in this first part of the story, we see that Jesus allows suffering so that he can strengthen our faith. Jesus allows suffering so that he can strengthen our faith. If you look with me now at verses 11 through 16. After saying these things, he said to them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover." Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest and sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Jesus allows suffering so that he can strengthen our faith. We see here first that Jesus' attention turns away from Lazarus and his sisters for a moment and turns to his disciples. Now, of course, we know that Jesus loved Lazarus and his family, but Jesus also loved his disciples. So this was not just something that he wanted to use to train, to teach, and to grow the faith of Lazarus and his sisters. He also wanted to use this for the benefit, the spiritual growth of his disciples as well. So we see here that Jesus refers to Lazarus' death as sleeping. Paul also refers to death as sleeping when you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15, when he says, "We shall not all sleep, but we will all be changed." So it still is appropriate to talk about death in the words of sleep, especially if you believe in the resurrection, right? For all of us, death is just going to be sleeping. Because one day we will be fully alive, even more alive than we are now. So we see that he refers to Jesus' death as sleeping, and his disciples clearly do not understand what he is saying. This is a common theme throughout the Gospels, that the disciples are always at least one step behind Jesus. They always are, it's almost always, they're scratching their heads trying to figure out what Jesus is talking about, what Jesus is really doing. And here we have another one. And of course, not to be too hard on our disciples here in this passage, because we also struggle with the same thing. This highlights, though, the disciples' need for greater spiritual growth and understanding. It shows that they need to grow in their spiritual understanding, which also means they need to grow in their faith. Jesus was not only using this trial to show his glory and love, but also to mature his disciples' spiritual understanding and faith. So, as we think through these things that we are seeing in this first part of the story, we can apply these directly to us when we are also struggling with a trial of any kind. Jesus is doing these things in our lives as well. There might be even more that he's doing to a certain degree, but he is at least doing these things. So we see then that in verses 14 to 15, Jesus spells out the reality of the situation to his disciples very clearly. He says, "Lazarus has died." And then in the midst of the suffering, Jesus says that he was glad because of the far greater benefits that the suffering would bring about. Again, this strikes us as foreign, right? Who should be glad that someone has suffered? And even though it's foreign to us, it shouldn't be foreign to us, because this is the way God works with his children. This is the way that he pushes us and pulls us to our final destination, to our closer relationship with him, to the maturity that he has called us all to have. So he was glad because even though there was suffering, Jesus looks at the suffering as being this important, and he looks at the spiritual growth and maturity as being this important. So when you measure the two, it makes sense that Jesus was glad, because he clearly saw that the priority was the maturity and the growth, not the suffering and the relief from the suffering. So he was clearly glad about this. And we also, to a certain degree, should be glad when we suffer, because we know what Jesus is doing in our lives. And then bring it down to verse 16. We see that Thomas, who we hardly hear ever from in the Gospels, right? He goes ahead and shares his 2 cents worth. Thomas, the doubting disciple, voices what probably all the disciples were thinking, though. This probably wasn't just Thomas. We know that all the disciples were concerned about Jesus going to Judea. But Thomas decides to put it in those words that are, you could say, unforgettable. It really gives a window into his personality, right? Instead of making Jesus' thoughts and goals his thoughts and goals, and the disciples as well, they were simply focused on their own lives and on their own well-being. So Thomas called the twins, said to his fellow disciples, come on guys, let's go so we can die too. We can go die with him. So this again gives us a window into the faith nature, the nature of the faith of Thomas and of the disciples. Their faith was not very strong. They thought, okay, this is it. But at least they were willing to go with Jesus, right? At least they were willing that if it meant their death, that they would be with their teacher. So at least they didn't at that point just say, sorry, Jesus, you're going by yourself. So even though their faith needed to grow, their faith was not as bad as it could have been. So Jesus allows suffering so that he can strengthen our faith. For those of us who have played sports or been in some sort of physically demanding situation, we probably know what it's like to have a coach tell us to do some sort of drill that we think is completely unnecessary and that we don't understand at all why he's making us do it. Take, for example, someone who's training to be a Marine. There are many different training exercises that you have to go through if you are training to be a Marine. And a couple of them at first might seem like, why do we have to spend all this time on this? One of them is how to break a fall. So let's say that you are in a combat situation and you're in a very dangerous plot of ground, and the difference between you staying alive or you dying is whether you can handle yourself if you lose your balance. If you lose your balance, do you know what to do after that? But, your very green recruit might think, well, let's spend time target practicing, or let's spend time, doing martial arts training or things like that. Why do we have to learn how to break a fall? Why do we have to fall over and over and over and over again? It doesn't make sense. But when you think about the reality of the situation, it's one of the best things you could ever train to do. Same thing about digging a foxhole. All right, if you don't have a shovel and you don't know how to dig a foxhole, you'll die just like that. But if you can build yourself some protection and know how to do it quickly, then you live to fight another day. So while these might not seem important at first to being a Marine, if you know how to do these things, you might stay alive a whole lot longer than if you do not know these defensive techniques. Now, in the same way, we might think that a lot of the difficulties and suffering that we're experiencing are completely unnecessary. Not only are they unnecessary, they are wrong for us to be suffering, right? And they're messing up our lives. Our own perfectly planned lives are being completely overturned. Now, we've probably all had thoughts like this when we're going through difficult times, right? Maybe you had thoughts like that even this morning when you were reminded of the struggle that you have been going through, or all 5 struggles that you've been going through all at once. Instead of immediately giving God the benefit of the doubt, though, and reminding ourselves that he has a perfect plan and a purpose, and that everything that he does is good, what do we do instead? We allow our minds to go in the opposite direction. We become moody. We become discouraged. We become angry, jealous, covetousness, and the list goes on of all the negative thoughts and emotions that we allowed to crowd out the truth of the gospel. But according to this passage, the suffering that we face is designed to strengthen our faith, our spiritual understanding, and our walk with God. So, when your health doesn't seem to be improving, when that person at work or your neighbor, your family member keeps treating you wrongly, when you see your savings account keep shrinking, remember that God is watching and he is working to strengthen your faith and to draw you closer to him. These are the best and the most important things that could ever happen to us. So let's continually remind ourselves of this truth and not get discouraged. Jesus allows suffering so that he can strengthen our faith. And this brings us to what I would say is the main idea of this passage. Jesus allows suffering so that we will believe that he is the Son of God. Jesus allows suffering so that we will believe that he is the Son of God. Now, after thinking on that statement, after reading that statement, you might say, well, I already believe that he is the Son of God. Why am I still suffering? And this is a good question. And the answer is often simply that, again, our faith is not quite where it needs to be yet. And I think we'd all agree with that. While we believe something is true, it isn't often that important to us, right? You believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Great. What difference is that making in your daily life? Well, I guess maybe a little bit of difference. Well, it shouldn't be making a little bit of difference. It should be making all the difference in our daily lives. That Jesus, being the Son of God, is our Savior, that he loves us, that he is in control of our lives, that he has an amazing future prepared for us. These are the thoughts that should be controlling us day to day. God wants us not only to believe that Jesus is his Son and the way to eternal life, he wants this most important truth in our lives day to day. He wants this truth to be the driving force of our days. He wants it to be continually on our minds and on our hearts. So, suffering will continue. And when it does, remember its purpose: to show God's glory, to show God's love, and to strengthen our faith. Jesus allows suffering so that we will believe that he is the Son of God. Now, before we bring our time to a close, I also want to remind us all here that Jesus suffered more infinitely than we ever will suffer, or could even imagine suffering. So this whole message has been mainly directed to people who have accepted Jesus Christ, who have given their lives to Jesus Christ, who have repented of their sin, and who have completely trusted Christ for their salvation. But maybe there's someone here and you have not done that. You have not been willing to admit that you are a sinful person. You are a wicked person in God's sight. You are the enemy of God because of that sin. Because God is holy, he cannot stand your sin. And the only way that you can be rescued from God's eternal judgment on your sin, and the only way you can have true meaning in life, is for you to accept Jesus' sacrifice as the way to eternal life. Jesus died in your place so that you could have eternal life. And as Lazarus was resurrected temporarily, this is a picture of the eternal resurrection that we all will have if we have trusted Jesus Christ. So if you have not trusted Christ, won't you do that today?